You're listening to Module 9 of the online International Security course. We are beginning the second half of the course with this particular module. Our focus here will be transitioning our understanding of security from security of states to human security, that form of security that attempts to protect humans as well as states. We've seen in the first half of the course that security has been understood as something that has been the right and responsibility of states, and that people, individual human beings, were seen as being protected when the state that they were a resident of was also protected. Yet something interesting is observable in the last 50 years or so. We see that states are relatively secure these days, that you don't see a lot of states being destroyed, you don't see a lot of states being conquered, you don't see a lot of states being annexed. There are some examples or some exceptions here. Tibet in 1950 was conquered by China, and today Tibet is still part of China. More recently, we've seen Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, which was formerly part of Ukraine, annexed by Russia, and that's more or less a fait accompli now. No one really sees Crimea going back to Ukraine anytime soon. But with these exceptions observed and noted, generally speaking, we don't see any states being destroyed or conquered. We don't even see wars that destroy states taking place anymore. The last big war that saw states being destroyed and new states being created was World War II. Even the Cold War, which saw an extended period of tension between two superpowers, did not result in the actual war taking place. And notice at the end of that conflict, you do see the end of the Soviet Union, but the end of the Soviet Union means the creation of new states, not the absence necessarily of old ones. Yet states still really see themselves as still the focus of security preparation. They still prepare themselves and spend most of their security dollars on the threats to their sovereignty, the threats to their security. And this is problematic because, as we'll see here in a moment, real insecurity doesn't really take place at the state level anymore. Indeed, when we look at who has been the victim of violence, who has seen their security eroded, or perhaps a better way of saying this, who has not enjoyed the same level of security that states now enjoy, and we can look at the individual humans and communities and groups of human beings. Intrastate violence, violence that takes place within a territory, within a defined sovereign state, has killed more people since World War II than interstate conflict has. We have a series of mass killings, we have a series of genocides that take place on average since World War II about every 10 years. We might have something going on right now in Burma or Myanmar with regards to the Rohingya Muslims who are in the process of being ethnically cleansed and mass deported out of Burma right now. And there's fears that the death toll from that is already in the hundreds of thousands and could approach 1 million if nothing is done anytime soon. So, generally we average one genocide every 10 years since the end of World War II. And it's not just violence as a result of political conflict, even threats associated with globalization like transnational crime, infectious disease, income inequality, economic inequality. These are all now global phenomenon that are interconnected with each other and are beyond the ability of one state to try to address. So without global cooperation, a lot of these globalized threats can have a great deal of impact on individual human lives and can destroy and damage human lives, even if the state or specific states are interested in trying to curb these particular threats. So the focus here, both in this lecture and for the rest of the course, is this notion of human security. The United Nations Development Program attempted to define human security in 2009, giving it the definition of liberation of human beings from those intensive, extensive, prolonged, and comprehensive threats to which their lives and freedoms are vulnerable. And notice what we're doing here is we're changing the focus of security from security of states to security of individuals and groups of human beings. The logic here being that what's necessary to protect a state is not the same thing necessarily as what's necessary to protect a human being. It will involve military force. It will involve, the need to deploy and preparing to deploy violence and coercion. But in other cases, it may have very little to do with violence and coercion. It may be, as we'll see in future lectures, dealing with addressing poverty issues, with addressing issues of climate change, addressing issues of safeguarding the internet and safeguarding networks of communication. So this is a very different type of different understanding of security. And so what we're interested in here is exploring this notion of human security a little bit more before we get into these specific examples of it. And building on my last point, if you put human security and state security side by side, and what's necessary to secure each type of entity, and how we understand security given that specific entity, we can see some rather dramatic differences. When we look at state security, notice the state is the primary object of concern. That's what we're trying to secure. Whereas with human security, obviously, we're talking about the individual human being, or if we're talking about sort of a group rights notion, an individual human community. That is not state, or something less than a state. State security usually involves force and coercion, the need to use force and coercion to protect yourself from the force and coercion of other states. Whereas with human security, you're talking about threats that may be beyond the ability of force and coercion to balance or to deter. Things like disease, crime, and poverty can't really be solved by sending in the Marines or deploying some kind of military force. Obviously, to address an outbreak of Ebola, for example, you may need to deploy some kind of military force to maintain law and order within an area that's experiencing an outbreak. But notice the disease itself cannot be vanquished in the way that an opposing military force can be vanquished. With a state, to protect a state against the threats of other states, the remedy is to build up one's own state power. That, again, may not be useful with the kinds of threats that we see in human security. Here, the remedy is to build up things like institutions, networks, and communities to facilitate information sharing, to exchange ideas about best practices, a whole host of other things that can take place without the state or with the state serving as a supplemental role. Finally, stability in a state security context arises with the creation of a balance of power usually, and all states recognizing the virtues of that balance of power. In a human security context, there is no balance of power, there's just the threat and its elimination. So in the case of human security, usually when you're talking about political insecurity, economic insecurity, the concept of human rights is often offered as the thing that needs to be implemented to solve the problem of human insecurity. So how does this difference between securities play out given concrete examples? Let's look at terrorism. And we can even look at a specific example of terrorism, obviously the most famous example of terrorism, the attacks of September 11th. While the attacks were very devastating, given the damage they did to American infrastructure and the lives they took, the 9/11 attackers were not really an existential threat to the United States. They did damage, they caused instability and uncertainty, but one doesn't really see an army of terrorists someday invading the United States and taking it over. one of the reasons why 9/11 was successfully implemented and executed was because we didn't really take terrorists and the hijacking of airplanes as a form of weaponry very seriously. It was something that was largely the purview of movies and fantasy. Whereas if we look at terrorism from a human security point of view, and we look at 9/11 again, we do see thousands of people being killed. And while there's no threat to the United States as a result of 9/11, existential threat, I should say, for those who are victims, who are killed, who are injured, who have family members killed, this is a very traumatic and devastating event. And so the question becomes, how do we approach trying to deal with terrorism? Do we see terrorism as a threat to the state that requires a state-based remedy, that requires the resources and tools the state uses to protect itself, namely military force, to be used to destroy terrorism? Or is terrorism understood as a human security threat, better approached and eliminated through some kind of non-military remedy, or a remedy that has the military providing a supporting role? So if terrorism emerges, for example, out of poverty or desperation, living in desperation because of economic underdevelopment, the best way to approach terrorism is not so much to, again, send out military force, invade countries, invade Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever, but to focus on things like economic development, to focus on things like de-radicalization, if particular radical ideologies are being used to take advantage of the despair and listlessness of people who are materially deprived. And again, this harkens to and speaks to very different approaches to dealing with security and the solutions to security threats. Climate change is another way of kind of seeing this difference in security conceptions. Climate change probably won't destroy states, assuming it doesn't destroy the entire planet, and even the worst climate change wouldn't necessarily destroy the planet. It'll cause a great deal of disruption, but the states themselves won't be destroyed unless you're talking about island nations in the Pacific where rising seawater might actually engulf those states. With those exceptions, generally speaking, climate change won't destroy the state system as we know it. But notice that climate change can radically and have a devastating effect on human communities. Again, especially in areas near the oceans where sea level rise is a big threat, or areas where the desertification of the terrain impacts agriculture and food production. Again, these things won't destroy the states as they are understood today, but the effects of climate change can have a huge impact on human communities with regards to triggering migration flows, with regards to enhancing poverty, unleashing disease, and any number of upheavals that can kill millions of people. So again, if this is a threat, what remedies are best applied to deal with this threat, and what is the role of the state in dealing with these particular threats? And notice that even the threat posed by other states may be best understood in a human security framework. There's a lot of attention directed at Russia today and Russia's disruption of the American elections, or alleged disruption of the American elections, and just the threat posed by authoritarian regimes in general. Notice that in a state-based system, the states don't particularly care how the specific states are governed, so long as they recognize the values of the balance of power and are willing to uphold them. Then there's not any real worry about how they treat their people or how they might treat other people in other states. With human security, we do care about this. When notions of human security, it does matter that the people of Russia might be repressed by Vladimir Putin's regime. It does matter that a state like Saudi Arabia has a history of cruel judicial punishments to people who violate religious law, the religious laws of that state. So this human security notion is also a good way of thinking about threats that are posed by other states. And again, how states that are victims of these threats or are threatened by these particular threats have to think differently about how to address them. Obviously, invading Russia or attacking Russia through a military attack may not be the best way to address the human security threat that a state like Russia might pose. Another big difference with the notion of human security is that it's a constructed concept, whereas security for the state was largely seen as a material or realist concept in that one observed another state, saw that it had military capability, one observed that perhaps had more capability than your state had, and thus you had to take steps to balance that power out. Here, the threat isn't something that one observes in the material world, it's something that one understands mentally, a concept that's constructed in interactions with other states and other human beings and other human communities. These threats can change over time because they are partially rooted in the world of ideas. Again, think about terrorism. Terrorism was not seen as a threat prior to 9/11. Terrorism existed and has existed for several hundred years. But in the Cold War, for example, terrorism was not seen as a real pressing threat because the real threat was Russia or the Soviet Union and its nuclear weapons. In a post-Cold War world, however, terrorism emerges as a new kind of threat that is given more weight in terms of a security threat because we perceive it differently, because we understand it differently, because our ideas about terrorism have changed. And so one of the key things about understanding threats in a human security concept is that they are largely a product of negotiations and intersubjective ideas, which makes them a little bit harder to pin down in a traditional material sense, but doesn't make them any less real or any less significant. And I already mentioned terrorism in this context. Again, before 9/11, terrorism is a marginal concern that's best dealt with through police measures, through law enforcement measures. It's not something that would be a focus of a military apparatus, of a defense ministry. But in post 9/11 world, you suddenly see the state, and not just the state, but the military apparatus of the state, the apparatus that is charged with protecting the state, take a very deep interest in it and go to great lengths to attempt to eradicate it. In the case of the United States invading Afghanistan and using terrorism as a partial justification for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It's something that would be unthinkable prior to 9/11. Even in the absence of a Cold War context, the idea that a great power would invade a subordinate power or subordinate state simply to deal with what had been seen as a marginal, mostly domestic concern would be unthinkable. Which brings us to one of the key concepts, we could say almost the core concept of security in a post 9/11 world, and that's the notion of the responsibility to protect, which gets shortened to the acronym R2P. The idea here is that given the observation that the great threat in the post-Cold War, post 9/11 world is the threat to individual human lives and the viability of group communities, that sovereignty can no longer be something that protects states and governments from mistreating their own people. That sovereignty, which was the right to rule your state as you see fit from outside interference, has to be altered and changed. This idea, again, think of the constructivist aspect of this. This idea of sovereignty has to change so that it no longer has the ability to protect tyrants and dictators and authoritarians, and or just states that are very poorly run from killing their own people or allowing things to happen that result in the deaths of large numbers of their own people. Here we're saying that individual security trumps state sovereignty. Sovereignty is not a shield that protects bad people from doing bad things to their own people. R2P is a concept that has slowly taken hold in the international community. 20 years ago, the UN first began to play with it in some of their deliberations. Here you have Boutros Boutros-Ghali, one of the former general secretaries of the UN, attempted to define the R2P concept as enhancing human rights and fundamental freedoms to protect sustainable economic and social development for wider prosperity and to alleviate distress and curtail the existence of weapons of mass destruction. Notice that we're greatly expanded the scope of how we understand security, not just a threat to sovereignty in the state, but things like economic deprivation, violations of human rights, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. In recent years, we've even seen the UN attempt to identify 3 specific steps or 3 specific elements of the responsibility to protect. The first one is that states have the primary responsibility to protect their own inhabitants. This is rooted in the previous notion of security that we've talked about, that states need to be free and autonomous so that they can provide for their people without fear of outside interference. The second step begins to take things to a new realm. Here we're saying that when a state doesn't have the ability to fulfill its obligations in the first step, the international community should provide assistance to that state in order to help it. What we're saying here is that a state that wants to provide basic necessities for its people, but for whatever reason cannot provide those necessities, that state can then call upon the international community to help it out. And the international community has an obligation to help that state out so that mass suffering and mass death does not take place. Then you get to the third step, which is probably the most radical of the 3. When the state fails to take the necessary steps to protect its own people and willingly chooses not to take the steps necessary to protect its own people, or is in fact the source of insecurity to its own people, the international community has an obligation to intervene or take some kind of action to either force the state to take responsibility or to take responsibility itself. And again, we are completely throwing aside the notion of sovereignty here. That if there are situations where the state refuses to abide by the norms of civilization and the responsibility to provide for its people, it's not that the international community ought to intervene, it's that the international community must intervene. Now, we've already seen this concept employed in certain limited cases. If you think back to 2011, you have the bombing of Libya by NATO forces. This took place within the context of the Arab Spring, when the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi was collapsing and there was an uprising against Gaddafi that was being contested by forces loyal to Gaddafi. The risk here was, and the worry here was, is that the forces loyal to Gaddafi, who were far more powerful, would essentially crush and massacre those who were attempting to challenge the regime of Gaddafi and ultimately try to topple it and replace it with something ostensibly more liberal. NATO began bombing the forces loyal to Gaddafi in the name of the responsibility to protect, that if we don't intervene, there'll be a humanitarian massacre, there'll be a humanitarian catastrophe, there'll be a genocide perhaps. And so we can't let that happen. We have to forcefully and willfully and deliberately intervene in Libya through airstrikes and limited ground force deployments in order to prevent this potential massacre from taking place. Whether the massacre would have taken place had they done nothing is not important here. It's that there was enough concern that NATO action, American action ultimately, was justified. But with Syria, we see the idea upheld, or not upheld, but offered, but not fully upheld. Because you have a similar situation in Syria as you did in Libya. You have a regime, an authoritarian regime, clinging to power, using dubious means, including chemical weapons, to maintain its control of the state. And you could justify, based on Assad's use of chemical weapons and other types of weapons that cause mass casualties, as justification and intervention necessary based on the responsibility to protect principle. And there were threats made. There were threats that if Assad used chemical weapons, if he didn't change his ways, if he attacked civilians when they were trapped in cities, that would be sufficient grounds for Western intervention based on the R2P principle. But the West never intervened. Even before Russia intervened and took possession or took a presence in Syria, the Western powers did not intervene, even after evidence of chemical weapons deployments by the Assad regime were apparent. Instead, in 2013, they sought a multilateral solution in cooperation with Russia. And in subsequent years, Russia again deployed some forces into Syria, ostensibly to fight ISIS and terrorism, but largely to prop up the Assad regime. And of course, once you have a great power presence in Syria, it's harder to intervene. From Western powers, it's harder to intervene. And the R2P principle ultimately falls by the wayside when the threat of an expanded great power war looms in the distance. So to review real quickly, the responsibility to protect has three basic elements. One, states have responsibility to protect their inhabitants from harm. Two, that outside states have a responsibility to protect another state's inhabitants if the state that has sovereignty over them cannot do so on its own. And finally, outside states have a responsibility to protect another state's inhabitants, even if the state that has sovereignty over them refuses to do so on their own, or is the source of that insecurity. That sovereignty can no longer be an excuse for non-intervention. Even as this concept of R2P was emerging, there was almost immediate criticism of it, largely from developing states that accused it of sort of being a newfangled imperialism, a new manifestation of old imperial ways. Given that when we're talking about intervention, it almost overwhelmingly it would be the case that the states doing the intervening would be Western states, European states and the United States, and the states that would be intervened with or intervened on would be former colonial states that were developing, and that this is essentially a veiled imperialism, that humanitarian motivations are simply the new justifications. And in many ways, they're not new, because even the old style imperialism, humanitarian concerns were offered as justifications for those imperial structures. So this R2P, this norm of R2P, is really nothing more than the continuation of these selfish, self-aggrandizing, egoistic policies. And as I said, there is plenty of examples where even the old style imperialism was justified in the name of humanitarian principles, and so this is what makes a lot of developing countries leery about this notion of R2P. For example, the Spanish Empire was justified on wealth or discovering gold, finding glory in discovering new lands, but also, conversion, of converting heathens to Christianity. So the notion of spreading the gospel, which was seen as something magnanimous and in the best traditions of humanitarian good. The British Empire had the notion of the white man's burden, which was basically the idea that white Europeans, white Englishmen, had the responsibility to go out into the savage parts of the world and bring the fruits of civilization to these savages who will never be able to find it on their own. The French has a similar notion, the notion of mission civilisatrice, which basically is the same idea, the civilizing mission of raising people in destitution and squalor to a level of prosperity by learning the ways of the West. And this concern with imperial legacies manifests itself in the present day by this distinction that's drawn between the Caesarist approach to humanitarian intervention, the Spartacist approach to humanitarian intervention. Namely, should powerful states with powerful militaries use their power to spread human rights and goodness around the world? Or is this simply the same old imperialism in a new dressing? So to take the first of these, the Caesarist approach to humanitarian intervention. Here we're talking about Julius Caesar, who was, among other things, famous for conquering the district of the Gauls during the Roman Empire. The Gauls were seen as a particularly brutish and a particularly savage tribe of barbarians, and had always been a problem on the periphery of the Roman Empire. And so Caesar famously went up to Gaul, which is modern-day France, basically, and conquered the Gauls and brought them under the yoke of Roman power. And this was seen as a good thing by the Romans because, again, there's this threat, not just to the Roman Empire, but to the standards of Roman civilization and the humanitarian values of the Roman civilization that's threatened if the Gauls destroy Rome and take control of Roman territory, because they don't have the same notions of civilization and the rule of law and citizenship that the Romans do. And so the best way of dealing with this threat is to go out and eradicate this barbarism, to conquer the Gauls and conquer all these other barbarian tribes that could potentially pose a risk to these core Roman values. And that's what Caesar did, and that's what the Caesarists attempt to argue, that only strong states, modern equivalents of the Roman Empire, can and should protect human rights around the world. The United States, obviously, being the state that is most suited to fulfill the Caesarist vision. And notice here we argue that from the Caesarist perspective that sovereignty shouldn't be something that gets in the way. That if a state is treating its people crudely and in a way that leaves them vulnerable to humanitarian atrocity, the U.S. should intervene and topple the regime, topple the dictator, and set up a new government that's built on more democratic, more liberal, more Western values. As we'll see here in a moment, this is one of the scripts for justifying the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It's not just powerful states that call for this. Even certain UN conventions more or less acknowledge that there are some cases and some situations that require outside intervention, despite the norm of sovereignty. After World War II, you had the promulgation of the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, where all the signatories who signed the document agreed to act unilaterally to prevent genocide from occurring. And the United States is a signatory of this protocol, which means that if they believe genocide is taking place, they must willfully and deliberately act in spite of the norm of sovereignty to prevent that genocide from taking place or to stop it if it's already taking place. It's interesting to note that one of the most forceful advocates of the Caesarist position was Obama's former ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power. She wrote a book about 15, 20 years ago called A Problem from Hell, which made the rather powerful argument that the genocides that have taken place in the past, primary responsibility for those genocides taking place is as much with the international community that did nothing to stop them or after they happened or to prevent them from happening than they are with the states that committed those genocides or allowed them to happen. And so this is a woman who occupies or used to occupy a very high position in the foreign policy establishment, making this very profound Caesarist position. And it's believed that she was one of the voices that was speaking most loudly, along with Hillary Clinton, for Obama to intervene in Libya during that particular intervention. We contrast the Caesarist position with the Spartacist position. The reference here is to the famous Roman gladiator Spartacus, who is probably most famous or most familiar in his Hollywood representation from the 1960s in the Kirk Douglas movie, the movie starring Kirk Douglas. In the tradition of slaves rising up against their masters, the Spartacist sees powerful states as the source of much of the suffering in the world, and that the best policy with regards to humanitarian suffering is for states to not get involved in the affairs of others, sort of to hold to that traditional sovereign concept. The reason why Spartacists are so cynical is because they see when powerful states intervening, they largely make the problem worse than actually solve the humanitarian problem that was the justification or the pretext for the intervention in the first place. Talk of human rights and liberalism and spreading liberal values usually is just window dressing that justifies what is in reality an aggressive imperial-like action. You can never trust an imperial state to do the right thing. And so it's best to be skeptical and weary of any powerful state intervening for ostensibly humanitarian purposes. And Spartacism is largely sort of the approach to anti-colonialism that you see from the developing world. Those in international law who take a Spartacist point of view will point to Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is famous for saying that states are recognized as sovereign and violation of sovereignty is a violation of the Charter. Notice that here we see the tension between sort of the responsibility to protect and the old style state security, although the irony here is that the sovereignty is being argued on behalf of those who had traditionally been the victim of the state or powerful states and want sovereignty to protect them the way it used to protect the powerful states. I already alluded to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the United States. It's probably the best place to see these arguments play out. So let's look at this case right now. So the Caesarist position, or the Caesarist approach to the problem of Iraq, is one where the U.S. should invade Iraq to eliminate it as a source of potential terrorist support and funding, to prevent its acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, which, as we've seen with the quote from Boutros Boutros-Ghali, was one of the tenets, or the original tenets, or the early tenets of the responsibility to protect, and to protect the rights from the tyrant Saddam Hussein. That in Iraq, in Iraq ruled by Saddam Hussein, you see every example of modern day barbarism. And so if you're interested in spreading human rights around the world, if you're interested in upholding human rights, you will want to support an American intervention in Iraq in order to uphold these values. And notice who supports the intervention in 2003. It doesn't fall neatly into sort of hawks and doves or liberals and conservatives. You see neoconservatives express a desire and a support for the invasion of Iraq based on spreading freedom and democracy around the world. You also see quote-unquote liberal internationalists, people who are usually skeptical of American power, nevertheless see that in this particular case, the deployment of American power is actually a good thing because it means the spread of liberal values, it means the spread of human rights, and these other important values. But then you have the Spartacist viewpoint, which says that in reality, the justifications for the invasion of Iraq based on human rights are poorly veiled window dressing that conceals what the real motivations are, which is expansion of American power, opportunities to expand American influence in the Middle East, especially tantalizing given that the Soviet Union no longer exists and there's no longer a great power in the near region to check American expansion there, that the American national interest will require there being free-flowing oil out of the Middle East, and that Iraq is a major producer of this oil. And so it's an American national interest to see that Iraq is run by a state that's compliant to American interests in this regard. Others see that the U.S. has to support its allies in the region, Israel especially, which did not get along with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So that's another reason to intervene that has little or nothing to do with human rights. And again, notice that the supporters of the Spartacist position are what we call these anti-American activists, not the best label for them, but those who tend to see American power deployed for dubious reasons usually. And also paleoconservatives, people like sort of Pat Buchanan, who might also be described as isolationist, or certain libertarians like Rand Paul express their lack of support or skepticism towards the American intervention in Iraq. The Caesarist and Spartacist position represent two extremes in a continuum. Most of the time when you see these types of dilemmas emerge, the solution is probably going to be some kind of middle way. Because it's clear that things like terrorists and rogue states are in fact threats. They need to be addressed in some way. They cannot be ignored. And sometimes the only way to properly address these problems is to deploy force, to deploy military capability. But as we see with Iraq especially, that simply relying on force and not properly doing the focusing on some of the other aspects of human security that don't involve force, that don't involve deploying military capability, have to be a central part of the planning and a central part of the effort to deal with the threat in this case. Because again, in Iraq, we see intervention, we see military force deployed, but we don't see We see human security issues minimized or put on the back burner. And the result of that is an Iraqi state that couldn't govern itself once the United States left and provided a space for groups like ISIS to emerge. So this is a very difficult and tricky balance to find for states like the US who ostensibly express an interest in protecting certain values, certain humanitarian values, but have not necessarily shown the greatest wisdom in trying to implement and spread those values.